Um, the final is Monday morning at 9, right? I haven't written it yet because I didn't know how far we were going to get today. But again, as I mentioned before, the final is going to be the same format as the midterm, only just a little bit longer. However, it will not be the entire 2.5 hours. You don't need that kind of time to do it. At a certain point, it's just kind of punishment. This is the humanities, after all, not the life sciences, where it might make a difference in someone's survival. So anyway, hour and 15 at the most, give or take, right? So Monday at 9. I'll be here earlier than that. So if you have any last minute questions or as you're studying over the weekend, but again, you've got lots of things on the Canvas site to help you. A study guide that helps you organize your notes and ask you questions about the different works that we've seen. A mock exam, a slide list. There's a PowerPoint up now with all the pictures from the slide list on it. I've edited that down from the first draft. So most of the early 20th century stuff is not there anymore. I say that because one of the Cézannes is early 20th century. One of the post-impressionist works is. Again, as you're studying, one of the things to think about is what you might say about each of the works based on that study sheet, but you also might think about what are possible pictures that I might compare, because the longer essay will be based on 2 slides with a similar theme, just as we saw on the midterm. And so you should be thinking about, looking at that list, what are some slides that treat similar themes, and then what might I say about them, right? I think that if you spend time thinking about it, Gabriel, you got the sheet. If you spend time thinking about it, it's kind of not hard to second guess what are the ones I might choose from, because I built the slide list around the possibility of having 4 or 5 really good choices for possible slides to compare, right? So you've got all that stuff to study from, and again, Monday at 9. We'll start promptly at 9, okay? So make sure you sort of leave early enough that you can get here by 9. Because if you come in late, even though you've got the extra time, even though we've got 9 to 11:30 or something like that, right? You don't want to be sort of going back to slides that we've moved on from, right? However, at the end of the exam, after the timed portion of the exam, there will be time where you can go back and say, can I see slide number 3 again, right? You can always come back to those, okay? Any questions on that? Last thing is about the term paper. A lot of people emailed me, and I made a number of announcements in class. There is a bit of a snafu on the Canvas side. It says Thursday, but then the date is Friday's date. As I mentioned in class, I will take them through Friday. I've got my grad class. Their papers came in last night. I have to grade those first. So I'm not going to get to yours until Saturday morning, okay? So that said, tomorrow's fine. End of the day tomorrow, right? Before I get up early on Saturday and start my grading, okay? As long as it's in by time before I start grading, I won't count it late, right? My hope and dream is that you will have the grades in hand before the final, so you sort of know where you are with that, right? And hopefully, as I'm working through things, we'll pick up more of the worksheets. You've got a number of those that have come back to you in the last couple of days, okay, or last week or so. All right. Any questions on those 2 things? Right, the term paper tomorrow-ish, and the final first thing Monday morning, but not as early as today. Thank goodness. Right. Okay. No questions? Then let's wrap this up. George Seurat was a participant in the last 2 Impressionist exhibits. He's a younger artist, a later generation of artists. And this particular image, which is quite famous, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right, on the right, it's in Chicago. It was in the very last Impressionism show. Remember, there were 12 Impressionism shows from 8 Impressionist shows from 1874 all the way through 1886, the last one. And this was part of the last show. And as you can tell from the scale, right, it's kind of different from Impressionism in a way. or at least what we've come to know as Impressionism. What does the scale of that picture tell us about the picture? About how he painted it? Is he painting outside with something that big? Not bloody likely, right? Very difficult to tote around a 10-foot wide canvas on site. And as we look at the picture, there's a certain stiffness to it. Everybody is either profile or frontal, right? There's a sort of rigidity to the composition. It doesn't have the same sort of vibrant spontaneity that we've seen in a lot of Impressionist works. Although he does use interesting cropping. There's part of someone's geometricized dress going off the frame on the right, the guy's legs in what my wife and I affectionately call the wife beater, right? The tank top. His legs are cropped off. And there's a sense of sort of spontaneous cropping and people coming and going, but at the same time, everything seems kind of frozen, right? So it doesn't have that vibrancy that we've come to associate with Impressionism. And that's because, indeed, it was painted in the studio, right? And what Seurat is doing is he's going out and he's making a bunch of small sketches. We've got about a dozen of them down at the National Gallery. And when I say small, I mean postcard small, right? About like yay. And making sketches to get the sense of atmosphere and color in these sort of Impressionist brushstrokes, right? These broken, unblended brushstrokes that we saw with Pissarro, with Cassatt, with Monet especially, right? So he makes a bunch of these studies outside. He comes back into the studio and he works on it for like 2 years, right? And the scale kind of tells you that there's a very deliberate, meticulous kind of painting, right? And that comes through, I think, with the posing. It has that sort of rigidity, right? Even though it was shown in the Impressionist show. And as I mentioned when we first talked about Impressionism, we should remember that Impressionism was not an ethos. It was not a particular one style, right? Degas doesn't fit well, for example, with Monet and Pissarro, right? That it was open to anybody who wanted to be independent from the salon. That was the whole point of the Impressionist group, right? And the moniker, which was meant to apply only to artists like Monet, stuck to the entire group. And people like Degas didn't like it, right? Degas, when he talked about his painting, said, "There's nothing Impressionist about my work at all, right? I'm not an Impressionist. My work is very deliberate. If you want to label me something," Degas said, "you should call me a realist," right? Because these were images of the working class, right? The old realist movement, okay? Now, as we look at the Seurat, we think about this fact that they painted this over the course of like 2 years, right? And we dive in close, we can see that every area of color is made up of a series of small dots and dashes of different colors. Like looking way too close at an old TV screen where you see red and blue and green, right? And every color, the pipe smoked by our fellow with the jockey hat, right, looks to be brown, but as we get in close, we see this green and orange and red and blue, right? Even the grass behind him is a series of colors, only some of which are green, right? And the entire image, everywhere we look, is built up of these adjacent, very regularized brushstrokes. You know, say what you will about Monet's brushstrokes and how they're unbroken, or they're broken and unblended. They weren't regular, right? They were sort of all over the place, different kinds of strokes for different things that he's painting. Whereas everything in Seurat is painted with the exact same kind of strokes. And sometimes they'll get a certain motion to them around the hat, for example, moving in a semicircle around the girl's face, right? But most of them are almost exactly the same size, regardless of where we are on the canvas, whether we're up close or further back, whether the object is big or small. The brushstrokes are the same size, right? And here a nice close-up of just behind the haunch of the dog, where the shadow moves to sunlight, right? And you can see the wealth of colors, both in the dark shadow and in the sunlit grass, oranges and blues and greens, melding together. And what happens is, as we back away from this, we come to where you're sitting now, rather than poking our nose into this Google Art megapixel image, right? What happens is that your eye blends the colors, right? Now, Seurat himself called this divisionism. In other words, each of the colors is divided into its constituent elements, right? And we know this from color theory, that every color can be made by blending other colors. Even the primaries, you can get away with that, right? You can get to a blue by blending purple and green, right? But as we all know with primary, secondary colors, right? Orange is red plus yellow. Green is blue plus yellow, right? Traditional color theory, going back to the color wheel, right? Where we have the three primary colors, yellow, red, and blue, and then the secondary colors, which is the blending of those, orange, green, and purple, right, violet, and then the tertiary colors in between yellow and orange is yellow-orange, right? Now, this idea of assembling colors on a wheel, which we're used to, was only developed in the 1860s. And it came about with a number of scientific studies into the nature of color. And this is what inspires Seurat to do this divisionism, what we now call pointillism, right? Not the term that he used, but the term that now everybody uses for this. Points of color, right? Dots of color. And this is coming out of these new developments on how color works and how the mind understands colors, how we see color, that we blend things optically when colors are placed adjacent to each other. Right? And this led to other studies that suggested that if you put colors opposite each other on the color wheel, yellow and purple, for example, orange and blue, what will happen is you'll get a vibrancy to the surface. You think about blacklight posters from the 60s, right? Haight-Ashbury things, right? Grateful Dead posters. They do that, right? It gives you that vibrancy. Think about even yield signs with yellow and black. They get that punchy sort of back and forth that you see things, right? And this came out of these scientific studies of color, that if you put colors that are adjacent to each other, not only will they blend, but they'll dance, right? And Seurat understands this, and he's playing with it on a sort of microscopic level on this monster canvas. Right? So this is, even though it has elements that relate to Impressionism, and it was part of the Impressionist show, right? It's a scene of modern life, right? In particular, urban modern life, which the Impressionists seem to love, right? Or suburban. This is the Seine River as it moves its way out of Paris towards where Monet lived, right? And it's there, basically, it's Paris' Central Park, right? The Grand Jatte is this melting pot of the city, right? And so even though he shares Impressionist themes for the pictures that he chooses, even though he shares an Impressionist interest in color and unblended brushstrokes, there's something very different from the Impressionists in this meticulousness and this deliberation, in the consistency of his brushstrokes, right? But again, the Impressionists welcomed him. He was part of the show. Now, in the early 20th century, when people started thinking about Impressionism as something that had happened in the past, rather than something that is happening in the here and now, right? They could reflect on the movement, think about how it developed, right? Historians in the 1910s started looking at Seurat and other artists in the 1880s at the end of Impressionism. And they started to realize that these artists are doing something different, that they don't fit the definition. Because by that point, Impressionism had stopped being this label for a group, and it started being a definition of a style, right? Monet, Pissarro, Cassatt, Morisot, right? Impressionism. And that some artists in the 1880s are going off in a totally different tangent from Monet. They don't fit the mold that historians had created for what Impressionism was all about, even though they were part of the group, right? And what did the historians then do? They came up with a new term, right? For these other people that don't fit the traditional mold. And the term that they came up with was post-impressionism, right? Another term they used was neo-impressionism, new impressionism, right? But Seurat, because he doesn't fit the way we define impressionism, if we define impressionism as Monet and people like him, Seurat doesn't fit the mold. And so we've now got a new term. This is not a term that Seurat would have used for himself, right? He probably just called himself a modern artist, if anything, right? But definitely part of the Impressionist group, okay? So we've got this movement called post-impressionism. And what we're going to be looking at today are a bunch of artists like Seurat who are moving in new directions, building on ideas from the Impressionists, but taking it in a new direction, taking it in a different direction, right? And we'll look at 5 different artists within this post-impressionist group, right? Yeah, Katrina.
So, what's the idea about the frame?
That's a really good question. Now, Katrina noticed that in addition to the painting, right, Seurat also painted a frame. He painted a transitional border. Maybe it's better than a frame, it's a border, right? To the image, that's part of the painted surface that sat then within the frame, right? And what's the issue there? One of the things that I think he's doing there, as you can see, is it seems as if he's playing with the color transitions, so that as you follow the color around, it does sort of the optical opposite of what's going on inside the frame. So look at underneath the little pug dog, next to the pet monkey, right? It's very artificial, right? Pet monkey. But the little pug dog is about to pick a fight with the lab, right? Look down below him. There's a little bit of orange there on the grass, right? It suggests some reflected light, maybe. And then the border around it turns blue at that particular point. Over on the right border, where we see this really weird edge of somebody's. Everything's kind of geometric, isn't it? You know, outline and geometry, and these are the edges of somebody's fancy robe, right? Some kind of cloak up above and train down below. And again, the border changes as we hit that. What's he doing with that? That's been a lot of debate on that, like what's going on with that. But I think what he's doing is he's creating a transition between you and it, and setting up this painting not so much as a extension of our space, which is the old tradition that paintings extend the space that we live in, right? But rather that it is an exercise in color. And by giving us that artificial border around the side, we become more aware that this is just a bunch of paint that he's applied in an artificial manner. And I think the artificiality of the figures add to that as well. So one of the things that Seurat seems to be emphasizing with this painting, with all of his paintings really, because they're very stiff, all of them are sort of really rigid, whether they're figural or not. We have a couple of nice larger ones that have them. But one of the things that Seurat really seems to be interested in with his paintings is putting them forth as exercises in technique, exercises in paint application, exercises in color theory, right? And this, I think, Katrina, is exactly why we sort of label him as this post-impressionism. Because those sorts of issues, that sort of artificiality of his art, right? That focus on technique is something that we don't see as forefront in the works of Monet, Pissarro. That said, it is part of how we appreciate their works. Technique, right? That's part of the criticism that was leveled at Manet way back, right? Not that long ago, but in the 1860s, right? Was about his technique, right? And so technique has become part of the dialogue around art, right? Not just style, but technique. And that points to something that I think is important for modern art, right? We move closer to the 20th century. Is this idea that there's more to a painting than the subject matter. Right? That a painting for an artist is equal parts reproducing observable phenomena, the world around us. Equal parts that, and equal parts this activity of painting, of applying the pigment to the canvas. And as those things become more balanced, if you will, right, equally weighted in the minds of the artist, what we'll eventually see is, of course, is that the weight shifts even further. So then, at first it was like, okay, recognizability is here and technique is kind of here, insofar as what we pay attention to, right? And as we got to the Baroque, we started to see, Frans Hals and Velázquez and Rembrandt, right? We're getting like this, right? And then it sort of fades away again with David and whatnot. But the Romantics were getting there. Think of Turner, right? We're getting there with Delacroix, right? And now with Impressionism, we're getting to this point where technique and subject matter are equally strong, right? And we're going to see as we move into the 20th century, if we had more time, in 3 weeks, right, we would talk about the fact that the subject matter is going to disappear. This is the road to abstract art, right? Is this idea of technique becoming as important to the artist as subject matter, right? And if you're going to focus on technique and you really want us to get, this is one of the arguments for abstract art, right, is if you're going to want to focus on technical aspects of art, then you better downplay the representational subject matter that distracts from it, right? You don't want people to go, ooh, cute puppy dog, right? The other argument for abstract art is not only that issue of technique, which is very physical. The other argument for abstract art is spiritual. That if you're going to make a kind of art that through your technique you remind people of a greater ideal than the world around you, which becomes increasingly important as we move toward World War I, then why should we keep reminding people about the world around us? Why not use abstract forms to suggest that there's something more out there? Right? So, your question leads to a very, very longish answer, right? But really it comes down to emphasizing the artificiality of art, right? The artifice. The fact that it is a painterly creation rather than a guy laying smoking a pipe, right? And that really emphasizes that activity. And it's separation from our world. Okay, another artist that we label as a post-impressionist, but was part of the Impressionist group is Cézanne, Paul Cézanne. And the reason is that, again, the Impressionists have this run of shows from 1874 through 86. And Cézanne was in the first 2 or 3 of those. Right? He was one of the founding members in 1873. And he gets horrible reviews, right? Moves out of Paris. He decides to ditch Paris. And continues to paint all the way till his death in 1906. Right? And this is painted after the Impressionist run is over. This is painted after he's left Paris behind. And why do we call him a post-impressionist if he's part of the founding group? Because I think on a certain level, Cézanne is doing something similar in outlook to what Seurat is doing. Similar in outlook, but different in technique. He, too, is very deliberate with how he lays the brushwork, how he lays the strokes down. It's not spontaneous looking. Monet's always looked spontaneous, even if it wasn't. It tried to look spontaneous, right? Cassatt looked spontaneous. Degas' tutus, scrubby and spontaneous. But like Seurat, Cézanne is very interested in very deliberate mark making, right? So, and what happens as he does that, right? He regularizes his strokes, not as regularized as Seurat. There's more variation than that, but a constant hatching across the surface. It ends up, if you look at this part of the field here, there's a wall and a part of a farm here. The field ends up breaking up into a series of little facets, if you will, little sections. Can you see that? Right, so he breaks this up into these areas here, here, and then he begins to play with them. He begins to push them around the canvas because he's focusing as much on the subject matter that he's set before him. He's focused as much on that as he is on the technical aspects of painting, on the actual physical activity of painting. And he ends up, when he left Paris, right, one of the things he said is he really liked the Impressionists. But he felt that most Impressionist paintings, he singled out Monet, he said, they didn't have any structure, he said. There's a problem for him. He thought painting should have structure. And one of his most famous quotes is that an artist should imagine his world. I'll use Cézanne's words, right? There are women who paint. An artist should imagine his or her world as being constructed out of a series of cones and cylinders and cubes. And if we look at his picture, we begin to see that everything sort of has a geometry to it, right? It may be a sort of organic geometry, but there's a geometry. There's a sense that if we look at the mountain, Mont Saint-Victoire in the background, right? The way he's handled the hills, they become these structures that he's putting together on the canvas, that he's structuring this rectangle out of a series of objects, out of a series of shapes that are created by these very regularized brushstrokes. And the more we look at Cézanne, and we'll see three of them at least, the more we see that as he's doing that, as he's breaking the world apart in his mind into a series of smaller structural units that he puts back together on the canvas, as he's doing that, he's making some rather bold and non-traditional choices, where usually, right, art creates a sense of space that moves back into space, but Cézanne is always doing things that kind of violate that make things that are behind seem to come forward, and make sections that are supposed to be separate from each other blend into each other. So, for example, what was I just looking at up here? Well, I've got some details to show you. Areas between the branches up above, areas like this part of the building that become almost impossible to read. This little like Monopoly house here, right? That's just a sort of a structure. It's just a little drawing there that's not really modeled in 3 dimensions. It's just sort of plunked onto the surface, a house with no roof to speak of, right? Because he's blended them together, because he's interested in how the different parts that he's deconstructed, how those can be reconstructed into art. Because for Cézanne, the issue is not objective reality, right? The issue is composition. And I think that's such an important message for anybody who's in the creative arts is, and I know it would have been a lesson I should have heard when I was an undergrad, because then I might be an artist as opposed to an art historian. And I got into art history because I was a studio art major, right? And I was always hung up with making it look realistic and not as worried about, cameras can do that, right? Not so much worried about the integrity of the composition and how something that I might see in reality doesn't have to be there in the way that I see it, right? That's an important lesson for all of the arts, really, is that, fidelity to observed reality is not necessarily the gauge of good, right? The gauge of quality. That, in fact, there are other things that are important or equally important, right? Here's a detail up here. I wanted to sort of look at this. Look what happens with the mountain. This is now this is Mont Saint-Victoire, and these are the foothills down in here. And just look at all the areas where one thing sort of stops being what it is. Does that make sense? Right? It stops looking like that hillside and starts to just turn into an area of color that then sort of blends in. Or down in here, right, where those diagonal brushstrokes, which he's favoring in the 80s, right, end up separating the parts of the tree. But at the same time, if we look at this area right in here, we see that he's really just thinking about these areas of color and how they fit together on the canvas. Right? He's making some choices where the background sits in front of the foreground. Does that make sense? Right? So this part here, right, just in here, is in fact the view through the tree, right, to the mountain in the background. So is this area back in here, where he's pulled some of the colors from the fields up into the hills to, again, unify the composition, right? As we look at it here, you realize that he's painting the background over the top of the foreground. And as you look at it, the sense of space is gone, and it becomes just composition. Right? Cézanne is an extraordinarily important painter. When he died in 1906, there was a big retrospective in Paris. Everybody went, right? Somebody asked Matisse, Picasso, what do you think of him? I think it was Picasso said he's the father of us all, right? Matisse said he's like a mother who nurtures us, you know? And they loved this stuff. They saw in it some extraordinarily modern ways of looking at the world around you, right? So he's very much interested in structuring his canvases. So one of the writes in the Phillips collection, this is up in Baltimore at the Baltimore Museum of Art. As I mentioned, he first he had moved out of Paris. These are in this town in the south of France where he's living. And he does numerous images of this mountain. More than 30 different paintings of Mont Saint-Victoire by Paul Cézanne, right? Again, I think what he's interested in is structuring his works, right? Taking these deconstructed areas and reconstructing them. It's based on things he's observed, but it's not faithful to that observation. So in this case, everything seems to have a sense of three-dimensional structure, right? Even the sky. Look to the right of the mountain. And doesn't it almost look as if that section of open sky has been turned into a three-dimensional object that comes out at us, that it's shaded on the edge next to the mountain, and then it seems to come out, right? The void, in the emptiness, if you will, of the composition, the empty parts, have every bit as much solidity as the solid parts do. Khadijah.
When you describe this way as
3D abstract. How would you describe this? Well, some people have suggested that this is the basis of Cubism, right? That this is, and in fact, even if you look at the colors down below, right? Bill, you're working on Braque, right? And you look at that harbor picture that you have, right? No, Bill, behind you, is working on Braque. And that harbor picture that you have, it's this color scheme right here. And he had gone to this retrospective of Cézanne and had seen these things. Now, the color is here relatively accurate to that quarry, right? There's a quarry of red rock there. That there's a couple of towns that are built with those stones, and we can see some of the stones in the landscape on the right. But you'll notice the degree to which those rocks become these sort of, they're almost like I wouldn't call it that because I've never heard that term before, right? You could call it that. I think that'd be perfectly fine. But there's something about the solidity of the stones in the foreground that also looks quasi-transparent, right? There's a shimmering quality, like looking through glass with reflection on it, that you get, especially like in this area right in here, where you look through it and you look at it, and he's pulling down colors from the mountain into the rocks down below, and he's pulling up some of this quarry color up into the mountains, and the sky color ends up coming down, and we've got that big old shot of dark blue right here. Right? He really becomes interested in sort of breaking all the standard rules for painting, right? And sort of violating the sense of a three-dimensional space with all of this. It looks like a relief sculpture almost. You could almost carve this out of a thin layer of clay in a way, because of the way that everything seems to have a sort of low three-dimensional structure to it, right? Again, remember his quote about conceive of your compositions as if it was a series of cylinders and cones and cubes, right? And that's the sense with these pictures as well. Some nice details of this where we can see how as he's diving into these, he's really interested in sort of paint as paint, color as color, but also the painting as structure everywhere we look. And again, he'll paint these objects like that tree in the foreground. And then the way the tree branches come off to the side end up just being a series of fragments of areas of color, where as he's painted the background behind those tree branches, right? So we're sort of looking, let me get my pen here, right? These areas in here, right? They end up coming forward instead of falling back. And academic training would have told him that this was just wrong, right? The wrong way to paint. And even here, there's a sense that the sky has more solidity than the mountain does, even. And he plays with this idea again and again as he paints Mont Saint-Victoire. Right? I'm a huge Cézanne fan. I think if I could paint like anybody, I think I'd love to be able to paint like Cézanne, just for the ability to take chances like he did throughout his works. Now, this mountain is outside of a town in the south of France, as I mentioned before, Aix-en-Provence. This is where he grew up, right? And after getting rotten reviews in the first two Impressionist shows, he moves back to Aix-en-Provence. And this is kind of important for him. And it's kind of important for us thinking about the history of art for two or three reasons. First, one of the things we're going to find with the post-Impressionists, and this remains true into the early modern period, is an interest in fleeing Paris, getting out of the city. And the reason for that is they want to get away from traditional rules and regulations, right? And so Cézanne going back home, it kind of fits into that, going back to Aix-en-Provence where he grew up. There's also a sense of nostalgia of going back and painting the place where you grew up that we've seen in other artists as well. Romantic artists like Constable, Impressionists like Monet have often gone back home to paint. Right? But more important than that, and it's particularly important for Cézanne and the strangeness of his paintings that we've been talking about, is that he is working virtually alone. Right? He is not part of an artist's group there. There's no one else painting in Aix-en-Provence except for him. And that means there's no one to tell him, hey, that's not the right way to paint. Hey, this is the more traditional way of making that work. He can experiment more freely. And what we find is as soon as Cézanne gets down to Aix, this is when he begins to take off, really become good. I always, even as an undergrad, I found this out. Cézanne kind of sucked as a painter until he was like 35, right? And then all of a sudden he hit his stride. Like he just started nailing it, right? And I always took that to heart because at that point I was in my 20s and I'm like, yeah, okay, good. I can still get good at this, right? If Cézanne can be looked at as the father of modern art and he doesn't paint well at all until he's in his 30s, then there's still hope. Now that I'm in my 50s, there isn't, right? But for you, there's still hope out there that you could actually be a gleaming star in whatever field you choose and not actually get there till you're in your 30s, right? So, moves to Aix-en-Provence. The other thing about Aix that's really important for him is, like I said, this is where he grew up. His family was incredibly wealthy. His father was a very successful businessman. They have a townhouse there. It's a manor on grounds. It's still open to the public. Actually, you can visit it, right? And when his father dies, he inherits like a fairly substantial dowry, right? And that means he doesn't have to paint to make a living. So if we take these two things together, the fact that he's working relative isolation, artistically speaking, and he doesn't have to sell pictures to survive, these two things together allow Cézanne a level of experimentation in art that very few artists enjoy. And it allows him to push his paintings beyond the traditional rules of painting. Right? One last Cézanne, still life. He wants to make paintings that have structure He wants to make paintings that have lasting importance. He said that he wants to turn Impressionism into the sort of things you see in museums, he said. And for this reason, he does still lifes, because there's a long tradition of still life painting, right? You see them in museums all the time. And just like his landscapes with Mont Saint-Victoire, he uses the still lifes as a way to examine the structure of painting. So he set up the still life, he's painting it in front of it, right? He's painting outside as well for Mont Saint-Victoire. But again, he's not remaining faithful to what he sees. That's not the point of painting for Cézanne. The point of painting for Cézanne is to compose, to arrange the paint on a two-dimensional surface in a way that is itself pleasing. The point is not to recreate precisely what he sees. So if we look at this table with this fruit and a milk jug and a wine glass on it, you can see that the table is extraordinarily wonky, right? It just doesn't work. Look at the right-hand side and the perspective, or the lack of perspective on the right-hand side. How the top of the table and the slat underneath it, they should get closer together as they go back into space, but they don't. They diverge. Right? Look at the back edge of the table. Trace it behind that peach, behind the dish, right? And all of a sudden it starts to jump around between the oranges and the milk jug, up higher on the left-hand side of the milk jug. Because he wants to put these lines where they make logical aesthetic sense for him, rather than recreating the world around him. Look at the front edge of the table. Look at how many places the edge of the table disappears on us, right? And the top becomes the edge. Right? And all the areas where one set of colors are translated into another part of the painting. And they're not necessarily reflected colors, so much as he's knitting the composition together. So what do I have coming up? The order in which these things show up. Right? The plate with the fruit on it doesn't sit flat on the table. It's like it's got something underneath it or something, right? And it's not that Cézanne sat there and stuck like a wooden spoon down there so it would tip up. He's composing and he's thinking about this thing he's looking at, and he realizes that shape would be better if it were less oval, more round by sitting upright. Right? He realizes, it's not that he can't draw, he realizes that if he moves that line on the left up a bit, then he gets a series of breaks along that wall, that edge of the composition, that end up becoming aesthetically pleasing. If we wanted to trace it out, we could start looking for golden rectangles, for example, in these areas, right? And even the way he fudges the line so that it becomes this bit of blue that ends before the edge of the canvas over there, right? Again, he's breaking all of the rules of painting. Here's a close-up of the peach on the right, and you can see, as we dive in, all of the different colors that make up the wood tone in the shadow. And again, what he's done is he's drawn the colors from other parts of the composition. He's included them all here, right? And especially that wine glass, right? Look at how he's sort of discovering the edge of the glass, right? He puts it down one place, and then he moves it up, and then he obscures part of the other place. And then it just simply doesn't work as perspective. It's almost as if at once we see it from the edge and from the top, all at the same time. Right? So for Cézanne, painting is about composition. Painting is about structure. And with both Cézanne and Seurat, we're seeing artists that are very much interested in the activity of painting, right? In this case, the technique, how color works, in the case of Seurat, how structure works, in the case of Cézanne, right? And these are why we refer to these painters as post-impressionism. That and the fact that with Cézanne, the bulk of his career, especially the important part of his career, is after the Impressionist group broke up. Right? It's usually used for artists whose primary activity is 80s and 90s, right? Or for Cézanne, even into the early 20th century. Now, like I said, post-impressionism is a term that has been applied to a lot of artists going in different directions in the 1880s and 90s, many of whom had connections to the Impressionists, right? So another post-impressionist is Toulouse-Lautrec. Right? And again, remember that is an art historical term applied after 1910, looking back at these works, tracing the development of French painting at the end of the 19th century. Toulouse-Lautrec represents for us a second direction. So Cezanne and Seurat, painting technique, right? Structure, color. That's one direction. Right? Toulouse-Lautrec, expressionism, subjectivity. I guess Cezanne's there as well, right? But subjective in the way of trying to become increasingly more expressive. And how does Toulouse-Lautrec do this? Notice the degree to which the faces look like caricatures. Right? These two figures on the right, the woman who with the red hair, whose face is cut off by that hat, right? The faces you know are not what they looked like, but you could probably identify them based on the way in which he exaggerates their features. It's like cartooning in a way, right? He's capturing the essence of them without capturing the objective appearance of them. This subjectivity, this expressiveness, this expressionism is enhanced by the way in which Toulouse-Lautrec loves to use outlines, very lyrical outlines. This woman's cloak, for example, right? The shoulder line of that cloak is really terrific, right? But notice how Toulouse-Lautrec becomes interested in that sort of lyrical outline of the edge of her sleeve. And then how the rest of the coat, this man's pea coat, right, with his broad collar, becomes a sort of a vast expanse of black, almost like it's not modeled at all, right? It's just this area of color. The woman immediately next to her, this is even more obvious, right? Her greenish cloak, which is the same color as much of the rest of the composition, becomes this sort of flat area of olive green with a single outline over her shoulder line and then that area of purple just next to her face. And again, the caricatures, right? This is not how these people look. This is how Toulouse-Lautrec feels about them. This is subjectiveness, right? Expressionism. And his approach to painting that we see here, and by the way, Toulouse-Lautrec, these are on cardboard. He would go to these cafes. This is where he hung out, right? And he would ask for scrap pieces of paper to work on, right? And he would get like packing boxes, and they would bring it out, and he would sit there and draw and paint right on the spot, right? They're a nightmare for paintings conservators because it's not treated first, right? It's a raw cardboard. And you know what happens to cardboard when it sits around for a while, right? It turns back into dust, right? So preserving these things when they've been soaked with oil is extraordinarily difficult, right? Now, this interesting outline that we see everywhere, right? How each of the figures becomes sort of a cardboard cutout, if you will, right? A jigsaw cutout of the different figures that then fit together. And he flattens out the surface. He doesn't like to model it in 3 dimensions. This served him quite well because he was also a poster designer. One of the most famous poster designers of the late 19th century. These are extraordinarily expensive anymore. These posters that he was making to slap up around Paris. But you can see that same interest in outline and flat-filled color in these wonderful posters for these cafes. Now, the Moulin de la Galette and the Moulin Rouge are both nightclubs. They're on an area of Paris where Toulouse-Lautrec lived, called the Montmartre, the Martyrs' Mountain in Paris, which at the time was the outskirts. Right? It's kind of been swallowed by urban expansion. But at the time it was the outskirts of Paris. One side of the mountain faced downtown. The other side faced the fields around Paris. Right? And on the top of the mountain were a series of windmills from way back when, right? And the Moulin de la Galette, Moulin means mill, right? Was the bread mill, right? Or the cake mill. And the Moulin Rouge was the red mill, right? And in the 19th century, these old mills, now no longer functional, were built up into cafes and clubs and extended. And each one would have multiple places where you could go drink. They had 3 or 4 different bars, but they also had live entertainment, right? And these entertainments were everything from dance to cabaret to circus performances, right? The Nicole Kidman movie and all of that, right? And Toulouse-Lautrec hung out there. These are very autobiographical works, and they fit into the subjectivity based on that sort of autobiographical interest, right? Now, what do we know about Toulouse-Lautrec and his biography? He came from an extraordinarily wealthy family. The hyphenated last name, Henri of Toulouse and Lautrec. Toulouse is a town in southwestern France. His family were landed gentry. They were barons in the Middle Ages. And through the generations, they had intermarried within the family in order to keep the family fortune together, right? And by Henri's time, this family intermarriage had gone on for a series of generations. And he was born with a birth defect. He had extraordinarily weak bones. And when he was 12 years old, he broke one of his thighs, shattered one of his thighs. And the next year, he broke the other one. And this stunted his growth, right? And that's him with his back to us on the left. He never grew above about 4 feet tall, right? Very, very short. All because of the birth defects, right? So he was not a dwarf, right? It wasn't dwarfism. He wasn't a midget. He was just short because of the stunted growth, right? And yet, at the same time, he's the scion of a very wealthy family, right? He's the eldest male heir to this fortune, right? And once he ends up being injured, and once his growth stops, he begins to sort of see himself as an outsider. And so as he becomes an adult and he wants to become an artist, that pissed the heck out of his mom because they're wealthy, well-to-do family. You don't get to be an artist. He decided to rebel against the family, and he moved to this area of Paris on the Montmartre. Right, there's Montmartre. Where all of the marginalized people of the city lived. This was an area of prostitutes. It still is today. Drunkards, right? Ruffians. The French have a word for this. They call it the demi-monde, right? The half-world. An area where the lowest dregs of civilization. He's slumming it, right? To the constant annoyance of his mom. And the pictures that he paints, the pictures that he's most famous for, are these images of his autobiography. Images of himself. And he often sticks himself in the picture that he's painting, as if he's chronicling his life. These are his friends. These are the people he hangs out with. And he captures, especially in our picture, I think, at the National Gallery, he captures very much the sort of late night, what would you call it? Bleariness, right? That you can have at the end of the night when your drinks are empty and you're probably going to empty some more. Everybody seems a little peaked, right? The pale skin of the woman in the foreground, the guy in the back who's sunken kind of deep into his sauce, right? Yet at the same time, there's this sort of conviviality within the cafe that's typical for Toulouse-Lautrec, because this is how he's living, right? This is his life. Now, this idea of subjectivity, right? So we're looking now at sort of post-impressionism. We're seeing sort of divergent trends, right? There isn't one track for post-impressionism. On one hand, Seurat. On another hand, Cézanne. On the other hand, Toulouse-Lautrec. And they're each sort of doing different things, right? That have some root in Impressionism, couldn't exist without Impressionism, but they aren't really best labeled Impressionists, right? And this subjective trend, this expressionist trend that we see with Toulouse-Lautrec is best personified with Van Gogh. Right? We've all heard of Vincent van Gogh, right? Painting sell for way too much money. At the same time, not overrated, right? And a picture that I'm sure you've probably seen somewhere before. This is one of the most famous pictures in the entire history of art, right? It's up in New York at the Museum of Modern Art. If you want to go see it live, you can find it there, The Starry Night. And Van Gogh's biography, right, enters into his works as well. This is an interesting thing that we're seeing with post-impressionism, is the degree to which the artist's life makes an impact on their work. It's not something I've really ever talked that much about. I mean, we knew that Van Eyck worked for a duke, right, and that sort of affected, the patronage sort of affected things. But we haven't really talked about personality of the artist and how it affects their works, right? Yet, it's impossible to ignore with Toulouse-Lautrec and Vincent van Gogh. That these guys' lives affected how we understand their works, right? We have to understand that Toulouse-Lautrec lived on the Montmartre to get what these paintings meant to him. And we have to understand Van Gogh's biography to get what his paintings meant to him, right? So what do we know about Van Gogh? What do you know about Van Gogh? What have you heard about him? Anything? What do you bring to this class? You've heard stuff about Van Gogh. You've heard the name, right? Cut off his ear, right? You heard that, right? It was this one, I think, right? Cut off his ear. What else? He was sick in the head. That's right. He was a little off his nut, right? Anything else? Killed himself, right? Suicide as well. No, just that simple thing, right? Cut off his ear in an asylum affects how we look at his works. So when we look at The Starry Night, it's this extraordinary alive image, right? When Cezanne paints the sky, everything has structure, right? Everything's got a presence, but it's a sort of solid presence. For Van Gogh, everything has a presence, but it's an active, moving, vibrating kind of presence, right? And it's kind of pantheistic in a way, as if he sees the energy in the world around him. And knowing that he was nuts, use the non-clinical term, right? Knowing that he was imbalanced, mentally imbalanced, leads us to think that this world of movement where nothing is stable may have some connection to that. We also know for a fact that this particular image, right, these mental breakdowns began around 1888, right? And when they started, Van Gogh had himself committed. He checked in to an asylum, right? He wasn't committed by someone else. It was voluntary, right? Voluntary checked into asylum. And Starry Night is painted from the room in the mental hospital where he's staying. That's the view out his window during his stay in the mental hospital. He's there for more than a year, trying to recuperate from these mental breakdowns. We think it was part epilepsy. We think he might have poisoned himself by the paints he's using. The yellow is extraordinarily toxic that he's using, right? And if, you're cleaning your brushes and you're getting your hands dirty, we know that artists will often make a brush hold its point by putting it in your mouth because your saliva will harden just a little bit on the brush, make it hold its point as you're not using it, right? Get a little bit of that yellow in you. Distinctly possible that might have been part of it. But in 1888, he started having these seizures, right? And he wanted to get better, so he checked himself in, right? And we have numerous pictures from the asylum, right, in Saint-Remy, the mental hospital that he checked himself into. This is down in Richmond, and it's a view out the other direction, right, out the back way. So here we're looking to the town of Saint-Remy, and here we're out back. And in all of his pictures, right, especially when his life has gone a little bit off the edge, his paintings become extraordinarily more wild, right? More expressive, where the clouds become these morphing forms, right? And this is especially evident in The Starry Night. The cypress tree in the foreground, right, ends up looking almost like it's a green flame going up in the sky, as if he's trying to capture the sense of it being alive. And every element of it, even the light around the moon, right, ends up vibrating and oscillating and moving. The mountains in the background almost look like tidal waves breaking over the land, right? And even here in the daytime picture down in Richmond, you have that same sense of the waves of the landscape, as if it's rippling in front of our eyes, right? Again, through Google Art Project, we can get really close to this, right? I could blow this up even further. You can go download a 100,000 pixel image of this thing, right? And you can see that he's built the paint up very thickly, and a lot of this is that vigorous working of the canvas where he's, again, I think, capturing the energy of the sky itself, right? He sees in the Milky Way still things as if they're moving, right? And he's looking down to this village. And this sets up a very interesting thing for Van Gogh. And that is his sense of alienation, which seems to come out of his mental illness. So he is in an asylum, right? He's in a mental hospital. He's looking out his window, and he looks down to the town below, and the trees become these crashing waves. And he sees down in the town below something that's easy to miss, which is that everybody's lights are on. That everybody's hanging out with other people. Right? The town is marked by a church, but even behind the church in the bishop's manse, there's a light on. This is a world where people are doing things with each other, and Vincent isn't. Vincent is alone. Vincent is separated. And this is a theme we can trace through a lot of his landscapes, is that sense of alienation from other people. Right? Christina, were you starting to raise your hand before?
I was just, the church seems to look very different than anything else.
It certainly does stand out from the rest of them, but except I think when we get up close, it sort of fits in a bit. But you'll notice he's doing the same thing that Cezanne was doing, is that he's mucking around with the perspective a bit. But how do you mean it looks different from anything else?
It just seems the least colorful and most flat and the least alive.
That's an interesting point. I mean, the colors that are there, I think we can find other places, right? That bluish gray, right? But yeah, it is one of the few buildings without lights on, right? Unless it's the bishop's manse behind it, if I'm reading that right. What would this light be coming from if it's not from where the bishop lives? Who else is that close? But this is an interesting thing, right, about this picture in particular, is, with Van Gogh, we're lucky in that he kept a healthy correspondence with his brother, who was an art dealer in Paris, right? He's in the south of France. We'll talk more about that in a second. Kept a healthy correspondence with Theo, his brother, and he wrote a lot about his painting and what he was trying to achieve with his painting, what things meant to him, what it felt like going through these spells, right? And you can find them all online. And people have annotated them that this is the painting he's talking about. You can see it next to the painting, right? It tells us all sorts of things about what he thinks. And one of the things he talks about are cypress trees. And he mentions that they are like, he says they remind him of Egyptian obelisks, right? Like the Washington Monument downtown, because they bridge the earth and the heavens. And an obelisk was meant, it's got a pyramid on top of it. It's meant to sort of to point toward the heavens. They were usually used as sundials, right? And he says that these are very much like that they are reminders of, on one hand, permanence, but because Egypt is a culture that's centered on death, Van Gogh talked about this, right? They also reminded him of death, right? And in fact, we know that historically, cypress trees in France are planted as the borders of graveyards. So they have a sort of funereal symbolism, right? With that in mind, right, that the prominence of death as a motif within this picture, the grayness of the church can be seen as hopelessness, right? That where there's life all around, there is no life in this symbol of salvation. That maybe there is no salvation. And it's easy to project backwards, right? This is 1889. He dies in 1890, right? This is a year before he kills himself. Shot himself in the stomach, right? He didn't want to die. He wanted to suffer, right? It's kind of a horrifying, sad story, right? The life of Vincent Van Gogh. So in any event, you're right, that there's something about the church that sort of stands out as usually a sign of hope, but is it for Van Gogh? Right? And that is problematic, isn't it? So with that in mind, so look, this one of my favorite paintings in the city, up at the Phillips, is this. So he moved to the city of Arles. So Van Gogh was born in Holland, right? He's a Dutchman. And he moves to Paris right around the time that the Impressionist group is breaking up, right? And he had started his career as a preacher. He was going to be a pastor. He was going to go out and he was going to preach the gospel to coal miners in Belgium. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to help people with his work, right? And he also begins to draw around that same time, begins to paint. And his early paintings are very much muddy. They're dark and they're brown. And it's probably because he's a Dutchman, because of Rembrandt, right? Rembrandt's paintings tend to be very dark. Right? So he's very much influenced by Rembrandt early on. That could be why he works his paint up so thickly, because Rembrandt did that, right? Goes to Belgium, moves to Paris. When he gets to Paris, our friend Pissarro, the Impressionist, said, "Yo, Vincent, how about some color in your pictures? Why don't you go paint outside instead? And why don't you begin to play with color?" And Pissarro even tells him, "Why don't you start putting colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel next to each other in your painting? It'll vibrant it up." So early Van Gogh is really brown, really mucky, kind of gray, working class images. Late Van Gogh opens up with color because of Pissarro, right? Van Gogh, because he comes from this preacherly background, he hates Paris. He just detests it. It doesn't last very long. Because Paris is full of sin, right? And so he decides instead to go to the south of France, right, to Provence. Now that's where Cézanne already is, right? And Arles, where both of these, Saint-Rémy is just outside of Arles, right? And both of them are very, very close to Aix-en-Provence, where Cézanne is. They have nothing to do with each other, right? The different temperaments, different ideas, right? But what Van Gogh wants to do is he wants to set up an artist colony there. He wants to have other artists come and join him and say, "Hey, the light is good down here. The colors are vibrant." If you've ever been down there, it's absolutely true, right? He's hoping to set up an artist colony. Okay, then the breakdown starts to happen, right? It gets in the way of all of this. Okay, and we get these images of alienation. So here he's in the town of Arles, right, which is really where he set up shop. Saint-Rémy is about 20 miles out of town. That's where the asylum is, okay? And now he's at the center of town in the public gardens. Does this bring in that same sense of alienation? I kind of think it does, but in a different way. Because you'll notice that there's a public garden. So we're looking at the main avenue of the garden. And where's Vincent Van Gogh? He's the one painting it, right? He's outside of it. Whereas inside of it, there are people. And there's a very solid boundary put up in those diagonal lines that come in the foreground here, right? And there's this guy with a newspaper who's really kind of creepy when you look at him up close, right? He looks like the Scarecrow from the old Batman comic books, right? He's got no face. And he's standing there lock-kneed like a guard or something. Right? There's a boundary that Van Gogh thinks he cannot cross into this public garden. There's an alienation, there's a separation. And we see that so often in Van Gogh's works. And again, it's impossible not to think about his own mental instability and how that then affects these works. Yeah, Jesse. That's my next slide. Exactly right. So even when we get there in this place that's supposed to be, the fifth room of your house, if you will, right? The public gardens is a place where you go to commune. And everybody in the garden is sitting by themselves, right? Nobody is there to communicate with each other. And they're all in black and gray. Now that might have been the style at the time, but it really stands out against those extraordinary yellows of the pavement, right? So, again, with Van Gogh, as with Toulouse-Lautrec, we're talking about biography being an extraordinary part of this, right? And some people have even looked at his paintings and realized, as we look through the letters and sort of come up with a timeline of when he's having his seizures and when he's feeling better, that if we look at the paintings that he writes about in those letters, we can find that when the paint gets more vigorous, he's doing less well, right? When he's feeling more imbalanced, the paint gets thicker, right? The brushstrokes get more violent almost. Look at how thick the paint is here, to the point where it almost looks like butter, right? Frosting on a cake. But also the degree to which he's placing opposites of the color wheel next to each other, oranges and blues, right? Learning that lesson that Pissarro had taught him in Paris about how to make a painting vibrant. And they're really wonderful to go see close up. We're lucky here. We got a room of Van Goghs in the National Gallery. It's like, we got about 8, right? Usually there's only about 4 or 5 of them out. We got like 8 Van Goghs in the National Gallery. We got 2 fantastic Van Goghs at the Phillips collection, right? So, we're really lucky here. And we got 2 new ones at the National Gallery just 3 years ago. They picked up 2 more. They were donated to them, right, by the Mellon family. But they're worthwhile diving into close up just to see this vigorous expressionist use of paint, right, which for his works is so extraordinary, right? Dappling on the top, the bush behind that guy's head, right, with this thick buildup of paint. So here we are, end of his life, right? I wanted to bring this in just to sort of end with this. I'm going to strike Gauguin off of the slide list because we're not going to get there. Right, I've got 1 minute left without happening. But with this one, right, the self-portrait, he did a great number of self-portraits. Sort of Rembrandt, right? And I think Rembrandt is for him a model, a role model for the artist, right? Also, Rembrandt's works have a sort of autobiographical trend. But here he is as the painter, and I love how down below, like Judith Leister, it's almost like he squeezed the paint right onto the canvas to look like the paint that's sitting on the palette. But again, everything activated, everything vibrated. And in this case, I don't know if you can tell, but he's finger painting. He's laid down this blue in the background, and he's come back and he's just dragging his fingers through it, wiping away the blue as he's engaging with that portrait. This is after he's cut off his ear, right? And he's posed with it away from us, the stuff away from us. So what we're seeing with these 4 painters, right? Toulouse-Lautrec, Van Gogh, Cézanne, Seurat, is a number of artists that are picking up lessons from the Impressionists, moving in very, very different directions. And all of these artists have an extraordinary impact on 20th century art, right? This really sets the stage for everything that 20th century art is. Experiments in non-representation, right? In non-objective representation. Experiments in the structure of composition, right? Experiments in expressionism, right? This is it. This is really everything we'll see for the next 100 years is in these 4 guys, right? If you want to know more about it, but next spring is modern art. I don't know what time of year it is, but spring 2020 is the upper division course in modern art. And if you need writing intensive, you can take it. Right? Okay, good luck studying for the exam. Let me know if you have any questions while you're studying. I'll be here early on Monday morning, but the exam starts at 9 o'clock.